And so today we have reached the final week of our 3-week series of order, disorder, reorder. We've been guided all along by the teachings of Richard Rohr, a Franciscan friar, author, teacher, and we spent time on what he has called a universal pattern made up of those three elements: order, disorder, reorder. And I've also referred to them at times as a pattern of life, growth, and transformation. On this final Sunday of the series, we're going to look at the final element of the pattern, that of reorder. And I'd like to begin by sharing something that Richard wrote and offered right in the opening days of this new year. This was not a part of his series on order, disorder, reorder, but I think it still serves as a really good preface to what we're going to talk about today. And so he began that particular article in January by referencing how difficult a year 2020 had been. All of the many losses that we experienced, all of the heartbreak, the chaos, the way our ideas of what was normal or what ought to be were upended, to say the least. And he noted as well as how there were some voices throughout 2020 who viewed all that was happening last year as being apocalyptic. And that oftentimes that word is something that is used to engage fear. It is used to engage a more exclusive, reactionary behavior by those who do believe and ascribe to and have concerns about the end of times coming. And Richard countered that by pointing out that if you look at the word apocalyptic from its Greek root, it simply means unveiling. And he saw 2020 as being one of those times when the veil is pulled back so that reality can be revealed as it is. And while that can be a difficult experience to have, it does not have to be viewed from a lens of doom and gloom and the end of the world. It can be viewed from a higher, spiritual consciousness, a spiritual lens, as a way that tells us how that we can move through it onto and into something better. And so then Richard wrote, no matter what is going on around us, it's important to remember that God keeps transforming creation into something both good and new. Instead of hurtling us towards catastrophe, God always wants to bring us somewhere even better. God keeps creating things from the inside out. And so they are forever yearning, developing, growing, and changing for the good. This might be hard to see in the moment, but it is nevertheless true. It assures us that the clear and full trajectory of the world we know is an unfolding of consciousness, with all creation groaning in this one great act of giving birth. And that's what today is all about. The time has come to experience the joy that new birth can bring. The time has come to experience reorder. To answer the question, what is reorder, we've got to go back and look at order and disorder. And we go back so that we can see that entire universal pattern and how these three elements work together. We don't completely let go of forevermore in any one of them as we experience and move through them. You remember, I know last week, perhaps even in the first week of the series, I noted how this is a pattern that's seen as one that we go through over and over and over again throughout our lives. And so I'm going to let Richard take us back and remind us of order and disorder. And he offered that by itself, order normally wants to eliminate any disorder and diversity, creating a narrow and a cognitive rigidity in both people and systems. Disorder, by itself, closes us off from any primal union, meaning, or eventually even sanity in both people and systems. Which leads us to reorder, which he says is the transformation of people and systems, which happens when both are seen to work together. Now, I would imagine that all of us have gone through this pattern many, many, many times over the course of our lives so far. And just a couple of easy examples that I can offer from my life. I can go back, to the late 1980s. Late 1980s, I was very happily married. My then husband and I, we had two wonderful toddler boys running around. And then, due to unforeseen, unexpected circumstances that were out of our control, we found ourselves in the process of a foreclosure on a home. The order that we had created, a strong marriage, happy marriage, healthy children, stability, some predictability, was now in chaos with several years ahead to move through that disorder. Or I can move it up a little bit more recently to 2006. Again, I left a very stable, very steady, fairly predictable, successful career in order to follow this new call, into ministry. So an order that I had had for nearly 28 years experienced a whole host of disorders in the form of changes, challenges, questions of faith and beliefs, and so much more that the seminary experience brought up during the 3 years that it lasted. For both of those examples and so many more over the course of just my life, wonderful and joyful reorders were experienced because I was still able to call upon the pieces of my original order that were strong enough to continue to support me and give me a foundation to address the disorder. And although I didn't always do this next one, the first step out of the gate, eventually I found a way to continue surrendering into the disorder and allowing it to stretch me, allowing it to grow me, to change me, to transform me. So how could we easily maybe describe or define the reorder itself? Well, Richard offers maybe somebody would like to refer to that as enlightenment or paradise or nirvana. Maybe somebody else might want to just refer to it as heaven, or today we've been talking about springtime, or in this season of Lent that we're in, maybe somebody would call a reorder experience resurrection. Whatever you want to call it, it's a victory that's on the other side of a failure. It is that joy that's on the other side of the birthing pains. But no matter what word or phrase you use, it's always going to be, as Richard writes, reorder is always going to be an insistence on going through, not under, not over, not around, an insistence on going through. And so it is important that we keep in the forefront of our minds all three elements of this universal pattern, no matter which one of them we happen to find ourselves in. Whether we're in the process of letting go some of our original innocence and most current order, or whether we are in the process of accepting the disorder, or whether we are in the process of trusting in a new reorder. There is a very interesting element contained in the process of arriving at reorder, and it's that of paradox. Paradox in our ability to hold it and our ability to grow in it. Paradox also reinforces how order, disorder, and reorder do work together. And this is how paradox showed up for Richard and how it helped him move through and get into one of the reorders in his life. When he began his vocational career, he was a very, 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 very conservative Roman Catholic. Now, this was before Vatican II. And if you're not familiar with what Vatican II was, this is going back to, I think, the early 60s. It was about a 3 or 4 year process where many changes that were seen at that time as being fairly progressive were made in various teachings of the Catholic Church and its practices. He also described himself as being very pious, law-abiding. He said that he was both buffered and bounded by what was a very stable marriage between his mom and his dad. And he also had a host of very lovely liturgical traditions of the church. He said that was his first wonderful simplicity or period of order. But then into the 1960s and 1970s, he entered a much larger world through his education. He obtained degrees both in philosophy and theology. He was given a very broad education of the liberal arts by his Franciscan order. It was a time that it was filled with what he called rational complexity and critical thinking. And just like Adam and Eve from the biblical story, who he was now questioning as to whether or not they were actually historical figures. But like Adam and Eve, he said he had to leave what was his perfect garden. And where he went was straight into a loss of some of his prior innocence and a time of disorder. But as more time passed, and as he continued moving through that, he found that he became very traditional and very progressive at the same time, simultaneously. He writes, I have continued to be so to this day. I have found a much larger and even happier garden. I fully believe in Adam and Eve now, but on about 10 more levels, because literalism is usually the lowest and least level of meaning. I no longer fit in with either staunch liberals or strict conservatives. This was my first strong introduction to paradox, and it honed my ability to hold two seemingly opposite positions at the same time. It took most of midlife to figure out what had happened and how and why it had to happen. So in the end, the reorder was one where he saw that the perennial traditions that had made up that solid basis of his first order had not disappeared. They had not failed him. For him, they had not even shifted. What had shifted and changed in him was his view from that solid ground. He said the lens, the criteria, the inner space, the scope continued to expand. He says, I was always being moved towards greater differentiation and larger viewpoints, and simultaneously towards a greater inclusivity in my ideas, a deeper understanding of people, and a more honest sense of justice. God always became bigger and led me to bigger places. Now, I have to think, I don't know this to be true, but I have to think that that experience played a very large part of his being guided to eventually create the institution that he remains the director of today, which is the Center for Action and Contemplation, one that teaches how both can be practiced simultaneously at the same time and work together to serve to raise our consciousness and broaden our perspectives and bring about and affect the change that we want to see for a change that works for the betterment of all. Earlier, I referenced reorder as carrying that insistence on going through, not over, not under, not around, but going through. In other words, this birthing of new life, it requires us to have necessary labor. But labor is painful, right? Labor is hard and arduous, right? I mean, any woman who has given birth to a child can attest to that. But anyone who has experienced any kind of creative labor, whether that is raising a family, making a living, building a career, building a nation, those people too can attest to it as well. Now, the medical world says that last stage of labor when giving birth to a child, they say that it is the most dangerous and it is the most painful. And they call that stage transition. The mom might feel like she's dying, but she's actually moving into this transitional stage of bringing forth new life. And when I was reading about that, especially again during this Easter season that's upon us, I immediately thought about how we in Unity will often speak of someone having made their transition when their physical life on this earth ends, which we do to reinforce the teaching, again, from a spiritual level, that life, the wholeness of life, that is eternal. Our spirit never dies, but rather it's being birthed into, its next form of new life. But as we think about transition, just as we're moving through our usual life experiences here, we can also remember that it is often in the midst of those labors that we can mine and find and bring forth and use deeper levels of strength and courage and confidence and wisdom. And wisdom is that divine power that we're celebrating throughout this month of March as a part of our inclusion of Unity's teachings of the 12 powers throughout the year. And Richard Rohr wrote of how he decided to practice listening to what he referred to as the wise woman in him as he moves through transitions in his life. He gets a blank journal. He carries it around with him wherever he goes, and he writes in it all day, every day, and just lets her speak to him. He says, here's what I discovered about wise woman. Her voice is quiet. I have to get really quiet in order to hear her. How do I know when I'm hearing her voice? She is tender and truthful. She's not afraid of anything or anyone. She does not give me all the answers, but she does know what I need to do in this moment: to wonder, grieve, fight, rage, listen, breathe, or push. She helps me show up to the labor as my best self. This wise woman is in all of us. And maybe we don't call it that ourselves. Maybe we call it God or spirit, or maybe we call it Jesus or Allah or Buddha nature. Maybe we call it intuition. The name doesn't matter. A disciplined practice of listening to it does. You see, there are a lot of loud voices in our outer lives. And then there's this one quiet voice in our inner lives. And whether we listen to one or the other, Richard advises us that the results are going to be exactly the same, because whether we listen out there or we listen in here, what we listen to will shape the way we see, will shape how we feel, will shape how we act and what we do. As important as it is to listen to others, and even if that listening is to someone who is speaking from their deepest wisdom, it's just as, if not more important, to make sure that we consistently make the time for solitude, quiet solitude with the wisdom in us. Only the whole self is ever ready for the whole God. Those were the opening words to Richard's final essay in his teachings in his series on order, disorder, reorder. Now, we could view whole God as being an equivalent to one of those descriptions of reorder, paradise, nirvana, and so forth. The question remains is how we view whole self. And Richard offered us a trilogy of stories to help get us started. And these stories are my story, our story, and the story. We want to keep in mind Richard's preface to these stories as it pertains to reorder, which is that reorder will always involve moving beyond the dualistic mind and into a more spacious and contemplative knowing. And when you think about it, I think a lot of us have a lot of growth to do personally, in both of those areas. And really, it's not surprising, because how can we expect that kind of knowing to be present and permeate throughout society if we haven't taken the time to get a good grasp on it ourselves? So to help get us started, Richard offered a vision for us to hold of 3 domes. And these are 3 domes that you can see through, and just envision them as you've got, the smallest one on the bottom, and it is fully contained in a second larger one sitting on top of it. And then both of those are fully contained in the third and the largest one over top both of them. And so we start with the smallest dome and the shortest story. And it's that book titled My Story. And this story is about my private life, each of your individual private lives. My story contains things like whatever it is that makes me special, whatever it is that makes me feel inferior or superior. It contains things that make me right or wrong. And all of these things depend upon how I see it. And this I, coupled with my thoughts and my feelings, they are my reference point for everything. Everything. This self, it's what I often see and believe to be the norm. And it is quite sufficient. That is my story. And Jesus taught it to be exactly what I was to let go of, because it is so limited and so small. And I am so much bigger and so much more. And so is my world. Moving on to the second book of the trilogy, Into the Middle Dome. That's where we find our story. Our story. This is the next realm of meaning in our lives, and it's about us. And it is an us consisting of things like our nationality, our family, our community, our city, our church, our state, our country. And these groups, they're very important. They are extremely important. They are necessary. They're wonderful training grounds for us, because that's where we get, a sense of belonging, a sense of relating, of connecting, of loving. And these are good things, to be sure. But every so often, the us starts to defend the boundaries of our group and begins to see it as being better than and superior to other such groups. And Richard paused for a moment there, and he noted that this is the story that he believes that has had, for those of groups for people who have, that kind of loyalty to a group, that he said, these are the groups, the story that has driven most of our history, and in his opinion, again, all of our wars to date. So finally, we get to the third and final dome, the final story, and it's titled The Story. It's the largest dome of meaning, and it's in this story where we find the universal meanings and the universal patterns that are always present in every culture. So as you hold the vision of these three domes, can you see how the story both assures and ensures, how it gently yet securely holds and enfolds the other two and gives them meaning? See, that this largest dome, that represents whole God, simultaneously holding its opposites together and giving sacred meaning to all of them. There were a lot of us, I'm sure, that were offered a story at some point in our lives that said that only one person, just one person, could live in the dome of the whole God, and that was Jesus. We were taught or told, and many today, continue to believe that only he could demonstrate being both fully human and fully divine at the same time on this earth. And I disagree. I disagree because that paradox is one of the greatest teachings that Jesus ever came here to teach, that each of us first and always is divine, always, with this temporary human experience being one way to discover that truth over and over and over and over again. It is one of the greatest stories of order, disorder, reorder that has ever been written. The more we go back to it, the more we read it, the more chapters, all with happy endings, we can write in the story of our own lives, our own growth, our own transformations. And they will be the stories of our whole self. God bless you.